Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Of losing his mother. He told his mother's story and honored her by doing that, right? You're honoring Charles every single day that your feet hit the floor. And then on top of it, you're helping tens of thousands of people get equipped for what they may have to go through. And you're helping them get equipped for anything their friends go through. You're also helping people that are going through the same kind of thing where they've lost somebody that they love, right? Like I have people in my family. My grandfather was I think I told you, my grandfather was the single biggest influence in my life.
Yeah.
And I, every single day, use things that he taught me.
Oh.
And there are people in my life, in my family, that are very, very close to me that don't ever want to hear about him again. And are constantly saying to me, why do you keep bringing him up? Why do you keep
Why not?
Right. Well, that's it. And, you know, to an extent, I mean, you didn't know my grandfather, obviously, but he was larger than life.
Mm-hmm.
And so was Charles, right?
Yeah.
Charles loved life. Charles was a magnet. People came to your house because, and he wanted them there because of the fears that he had, but he also was a magnet. He was somebody people wanted to be around. He had charisma, right?
And he did. He had that
popular.
times 10.
Yeah, and people loved how he loved life. People that love life are a magnet, right?
Yeah. And he was funny. I mean, I wanted to be around him too. I mean, you know, and oh my gosh, he always did the comedy for his audience. So what he told his friends, they would find funny that I might not.
Right.
But he always, you know, had different kind of humor for his mom.
Yeah.
And so he could adjust that. And
that's a genius. That's a genius. Okay. That's something that you're honoring every single day. Right?
Yeah. Well, he wrote all these rap songs. He was contracted to do his second album. And so I thought he would never leave this earth because of that.
Right.
And that was a gift to have all those lyrics after he died. And I put them in my first book, Diary of a Broken Mind.
Yeah.
Because you get our family life from my viewpoint and you get it from his.
Yeah.
And I wanted everyone to see that I made mistakes, but I also had successes and I owned up to those.
Yeah.
But also how he felt about himself, which I didn't know. And it gives everyone the insight of how their loved one feels, if they're suicidal, if they are addicted to a substance. I had no idea he cared so much. And I mean, this was a kid where he had one backpack when he died because he wasn't in the house at the time. And in that, he had a plastic bag of family photos. Mm-hmm. And it just shows you what was most precious to him in the world.
Yeah.
And he had those notebooks of his lyrics, and he had a toothbrush. And, you know, when you have all your belongings that are the most important to you in the world that you can put in one backpack, and part of that is pictures of your family, you know you count.
Yeah.
You do know you can. I mean, I struggled a really, really long time with the coulda, woulda, shouldas, and it was my fault. Just like anybody who loses a child, but particularly when you lose a loved one to suicide, we struggle with that intentional piece that it was preventable. Why didn't we, come in like Superman and notice the signs and rescue them?
Well, you weren't equipped.
No,
And
no,
that's what's so amazing about what you're doing now, because you are literally equipping people. You're
I
giving
do.
them the tools that they need to be able to see this coming, to be able to head it off at the pass, if it's at all possible, right?
Right.
There's no telling how many tens of thousands of lives you saved. There's no telling.
There's not. And every time I get to the point that I don't want to do this anymore, I quit. It's a tough space to be in.
It is.
That's usually when I get a note from someone that said, 5 years ago, I wrote something on your YouTube video. You had a conversation with me. I decided to live, and here I am 5 years later, and I'm doing great. And I'm like, wow. And how many people does that represent? I have no idea. But that one person found me 5 years later and did, for whatever reason, hunted me down and sent me that message.
You saved their life. That's why they hunted
And
you.
it's just, well, I helped them save their own life.
Well, I'm
Really.
with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
But if you hadn't helped them, they wouldn't be here.
It's really that someone listened to them.
Yeah.
And allowed them to feel. And I think a lot of us really don't know how to do that anymore. So it's not just listening to somebody, it is truly allowing them to feel like they've been heard.
Yeah. Well, we talk about this a lot, so I'm sorry if it sounds like a broken record for our listeners, but there's a thing called active listening, right? And there's a thing called piggyback questions. Okay. And, unfortunately today, what is considered conversation is you're talking and I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. Okay, that's a debate. I can tell you that because I was one of the top debaters in school in the nation. Okay, I was very good at arguing. I was one of the best. I would think about what they were saying, but I would be thinking about what I was going to say in rebuttal to it. Okay, my argument. The thing is, we need to get back to a place where we hear each other. And we need to get back to a place to where the people that we're hearing know that we're hearing. And the way you do that is you ask piggyback questions. And the piggyback question is very simply a question about what you just said, right? And what it does is it takes your conversation to a place to where that person understands and feels that you care. We call it caring enough to ask.
Right.
Right? That's where we need to get to. Okay. And I'm just crazy enough to think that I can have an impact with our little podcast on how people communicate.
Oh, I love that.
The feedback we're getting from people is they're changing and improving the way that they communicate. And it just absolutely blows me away every single time that I hear about that. Because that's really what this is about. You're equipping people to deal with a loved one that's in crisis, and you're helping them to head that off to an extent, and also to deal with the ramifications of it. We're all trying to help with tools, right?
Right.
And that's what this thing's about. All of us together, we're going to get there, right? We're going to get there. I'm convinced of it. So let me ask you this. What made you write the book?
It stalked me.
Explain that for me. What does it stalked me mean?
It was writing in my head before he died. And before he died, it was kind of, I think, a place I needed to go to see this sort of hero, and he was going to be in recovery, and he was going to be a star in recovery. And I think I needed that fantasy to be able to go through his addiction piece.
Yeah.
That one day we would be there. And then when he died, that story took a death, and then this other story emerged.
Yeah.
And it kept writing itself in my head. And I would, I started with the blog because I really wasn't capable of tackling a whole book. I could write a blog post. And that served as sort of kind of an outline, so that it's not a book of my blog posts, but I could look back and see a timeline of how things happened by looking at them.
Gotcha. It's the Emotionally Naked blog, right?
Right. So I have two blogs. One is mental health awareness education, and I have a lot of, that's my speaking platform.
Right.
And then I have like 3,000 blog posts on Emotionally Naked.
Yeah.
And they're kind of under one umbrella now. I wasn't going to lose that Emotionally Naked blog and 3,000 blog posts, because that's my heart and soul.
Yeah.
And I learned through that process, it helped me process it. And then I realized when I wrote the book, like at the 5th draft, his level of writing is up here and mine was down here. I was getting that first ugly draft. I'm like, I have to elevate my level of writing here. So I took one editing class, and she said, if you have any of these cheat words, and 2 of those on the list I went home and had them in there like 300 times. So I had to go, and I said, I have to move. I can keep 10 of them, but the other 290 gotta go.
Right.
So that was a lot of rewriting. And I felt like by the 11th draft, I had kind of upped the level, to his level of writing. And
that was an honor to him. That was an honor.
It was. And I think it's very different from any other book because it is very emotionally naked. And it gets into how they feel and how I felt. But a lot of books go to a really dark place and kind of leave you in the dumpster at the end. And even though obviously, my son killed himself, I have hope. And I had, I have been emotionally healing, and I've learned to integrate this loss into my life and find moments of joy. And how have I done that? And so I wanted to include hope and healing, and end on that message of hope and healing. And because that was important to me, because there are too many books that I read that, this is a great book. And I mean, it just left me really, really depressed when I finished it.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome.
And I want to add something to the listening. There's one thing I tell parents, and it's one of the most important things when I talk about ditching punitive parenting and becoming more of a wisdom guide. And point number 1 is listen more and lecture less.
Yeah.
And I think as humans, not just as parents to children, we need to do that more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The way I raised my children was the Socratic method.
You ask questions.
That's all I did.
Yeah.
That's all I did.
So smart.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did was my sister and I growing up just fought like cats and dogs. It was awful. And it was so bad that we would go to my grandfather's house, and my grandmother, we would sit at the table and we would bicker back and forth, and it'd make my grandmother sick to her stomach. She'd get up and walk away and go in another room and leave a meal that she had cooked and not eat. And that never left me. So I always knew I'd be a dad. And what I knew was my children were not going to do that. My children were not going to bicker. They were not going to argue. They were not going to act like these kids that have lost their minds in the restaurants and movie theaters and all. Like, they were not going to do any of that. They were going to act correctly, or they weren't going. And so I made it very clear. But what I did was I did it through questions. So when they would get into a disagreement, I would call them in, both of them. They'd come sit with me in whatever room I was in, and I would ask them this question: what's your job? And they already knew their job was to be nice. And they would say, be nice? Is what you just did to your sister or what you just did to your brother an example of being nice? No. Well, what should you do? Not do it again? What else? Say I'm sorry, right? And they'd apologize, and they'd give each other a hug, and they'd go on their way. But every single time that they even acted like they were going to get into a disagreement, they were called in to sit with me. Fast forward, Michael's 17, Madison's 16. Madison and Michael get into a thing. We're in a 3,000 square foot house. Okay. They're upstairs in a room, and I can hear them in an argument. All right, you two, down here right now. So they come down and they sit down, and we have the same exact questions that we had all time they were growing up. 2 days later, I'm driving with Madison, who's getting her permit. So she has to drive a certain amount in practice. I'm sitting in the passenger seat, and she said, Dad, and I said, yeah. She said, you remember the other day when you called us down? And yeah. She said, we had already solved it, Dad. They learned how to resolve conflicts on their own. And it came from the questions that were asked. See, we are literally programmed from the minute we come out of the womb. We are literally programmed to answer questions. If you don't think so, take a newborn that's looking around, right, and ask them a question. They will stop and focus directly on you. They can't answer, but they'll look directly at you, okay? Take a toddler, a terrible twos, right? Take a 2-year-old that's throwing a tantrum. Go walk in front of them and get in their face and go, what's wrong? What happened? They'll stop. They'll forget what they were upset about, and they'll look at you and they want to answer. The whole idea behind the terrible twos is they want to tell you how they feel, but they don't know how. That's what that is. It's all a frustration, right? So when my children would do that when they were 2 years old, I would just pepper them with questions. And eventually they got to where they understood how to tell me how they felt. Terrible twos went away. We didn't have terrible twos the way most parents have. We didn't have issues with our children the way most parents do, because they would come home and they would not feel good, or they would come home and they would be upset, or they would come home and they'd be in a state other than their peak state. And I would sit with them and I would ask them questions until they revealed to me exactly what happened and how they felt about it. They got it off their chest. It was
you hit on,
and they moved on.
Number 2, ask more questions.
Yeah.
That's true. I tell parents that all the time.
But listen.
Don't lecture. Ask more questions.
Yeah, but listen, right? So I had a client of mine that I was sitting with one day, and I was trying to talk him out of buying this property. It's a multi-million-dollar property, and there were a lot of issues with it. And I was trying to talk him out of doing it. In the middle of the conversation, he just left me. Mentally just left me, okay? And so I stopped and I said, Vince, what's going on? And he said, Mike, he goes, you know our baby? And I said, yeah, he's 1, right? He said, yeah. He said, we're really worried. And I said, about what? And he goes, we haven't heard, he hasn't said a thing in 2 months. And I said, that's not the same kid. When I would call and he would answer the phone when he was driving and the kid was in the back in his car seat, that child would talk baby talk more than we talk normal talk. Okay. That baby wanted to be in that conversation. So I would have conversations with that baby over the speakerphone, right? Because he wanted to be in the conversation. And so I'd ask him questions and he'd answer me, not in what you would understand, but he'd answer me in baby talk. Okay. For 2 months, he hadn't said a thing. And so I asked him, I said, so what does he do when he wants something? He said, he points and he grunts. I said, you know what? I did the exact same thing. And the lady that was watching me had 6 sons. She was a neighbor, farmer's wife, and the next farm over, best friends with my grandmother. She had 6 boys. She didn't have time for that. So I would have to tell her what I wanted for her to go get it. Pointing and grunting wouldn't work. Okay. And I said, so you got to ask him to tell you what it is before you, and he's going to cry. So get mama on board, right? The other thing is, when you go home, ask him questions. He can't answer, but when you go home, don't talk to him. Ask him.
Ask him questions.
Okay. 3 days later, I called him and I said, how are we doing? He said, well, we're not worried anymore. And I said, why is that? He said, we can't get him to shut up.
There you go.
All he needed was somebody to care enough to ask, okay, which gave him permission to talk. That's all he needed.
When you do that, you are giving them their power back.
Absolutely.
They feel powerless,
Yeah.
you know, as children. And if we're dictating everything, they don't have a say.
They don't feel heard.
They don't feel seen and they don't feel heard. This generation in particular doesn't feel seen and they don't feel heard. And we as parents can give our children that gift.
Yeah. And if you listen to what they're saying,
yes,
and then ask them about what they just said. Okay. So when they come home and they're in a rough place and you ask them, how was your day? And they say awful. You say, okay, well, describe to me what awful is. How was your day awful? Right?
Right. And then you shut up and you let those long stretches of silence, because that's where the gold happens.
That's
you
it.
Let them process it.
Right. Right. And they will. And you can see the wheels turning, right?
Right. You can.
Right. And you get them to it and you just wait. And then they answer. And when they answer, listen to the answer. Because if the answer is, again, something general like, oh, it was just terrible. Okay, well, tell me what terrible was.
Right.
Ask them about the answer.
Specific?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ask them about the answer. Dig, 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 dig. And what'll happen is you'll get somewhere where it's painful. That's true. It'll be emotional, but they'll work through it, and they'll work through it with you. That's what you want. You don't want them working through it with somebody else.
No. And you don't really want to give them advice. You just ask them more questions so that they arrive at the answer themselves. And it's not always the perfect answer.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you just failed that test. I see that you're disappointed. What do you think you'd do differently next time?
Yeah.
And maybe they give you some crazy answer that really wouldn't help. Then what happens? They flunk that test. It is not going to ruin their whole life. Guess what? They're going to figure it out.
Yeah. And it's their solution. That's the most important part.
Yes, they can own it. Yeah.
Yeah. And because they own it, they don't resent you for ordering them to do it. Right. So when the kids were growing up, I never told them that they had to do anything except act correctly.
Yeah.
And be respectful. Right. And respect authority. Everything else, that if they decided they wanted to go into a sport, they knew what our standard was. They had to keep that standard, but they could go do whatever it was. They just had to give it everything they had. Right. I never told them that they had to do a single sport. I never told them they had to do a single extracurricular activity. I never told them they had to do a single thing. They had complete carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do. They just couldn't quit it, right? They had to see it through.
Right. We had that same rule.
Yeah. And so it worked because they took ownership of their own life.
Exactly. We didn't dictate what they did. It's like, you tell me what you want to do. We're on board with whatever it is. And with Charles, it was a lot of interesting things.
Yeah. And it was fun, right?
It was fun.
Charles was one of the most entertaining people on the planet.
Oh my gosh. I still, he did karate for a year and then he didn't want to do it anymore. And I was okay with that. But I love the little karate videos we have of him. There's a 3-year-old.
Yeah. So my son takes Taekwondo.
He does.
He goes to his black belt test. We're all there. The family's there because he's taking his black belt test, right? Well, in your black belt test, you have to take on multiple opponents. Okay.
Right.
and he's all suited up, and he's got his head pad on, and he's got his foot pads on, and this is a kid that's 6'4", right? So he can reach up and smack you across the head with one of those long legs, a size 14 foot, right? I mean, this is right. And so I'm watching him do this, and it's kind of break time, and they tell him to break and go get some water, and he comes over, and I hand him his water, and I'm like, Michael, let me in. Dad, calm down. They're not going to let you in. They're not going to let you fight. I'm like, come on, get me in, Dad. Calm down. You're embarrassing me. Because it's, you spend your whole life protecting these children, right?
Yeah.
And now your son is in the middle of a fight with multiple opponents. Okay. Ooh. You can't make this up. And as a dad, it got my adrenaline flowing. I was pumping, right? My veins were pumping out. I mean, I was ready to go, and I'm like, get me in, Dad. They won't let you in. Calm down. You're embarrassing me.
Yeah. I remember my older son, Richard, was an umpire. Both mine were umpires because it paid a lot.
Yeah.
So my older one is an umpire for they were 10-year-olds. And I mean, those parents were into baseball. All of them thought I have the next major leaguer. So my son makes a call. I can't tell you if it's a good call or bad call, but he makes a call. And I mean, this coach gets all over him. Mm-hmm. My son is 6'4", and with cleats on, he's taller than that. So his dad comes up and he's looking up at him, and Richard was very thin, but with all that padding, he looked a lot bigger.
Yeah.
He stood there. I'm sitting there watching the game. I want to leap out of the chair. I want to punch this guy in the face. Time, just cuss him out. I sat there fastened to the seat. Yeah. Don't move. Don't say anything.
Right.
Let him handle it. To my credit, I didn't do anything, but he ended up just kind of standing there. Yeah. And he said, and he turned around to anyway, there's some guy that walks around and they signed the clipboard that the game's over. And he looked at the coach. He goes, this game is over and you just lost. He signed it over, had it signed, and the guy's like, I'm going to take you to the commissioner. I was just like, you go. I was so proud of him.
Yeah. But
I did not intervene. It was tempting. I wanted to go in there and save him. I wanted to give that guy a piece of my mind. I'm like, no, I need to shut up and stick to this chair.
You know what the best thing is about that? You got to see your efforts raising him in action.
Yeah.
Right?
I did.
That was the end product of all those years of guiding them and mentoring them and coaching them, protecting them, and
Yeah.
That was awesome.
And I mean, there are certain skills I didn't learn till later, but I want everyone listening to know that it's never too late to use some of the skills we're talking about now. I don't care if you have a child that is 44 years old.
Yeah.
You can start to allowing them to feel heard, to ask more questions, to allow more periods of silence, and any of the other parenting tips for raising mentally healthy kids that I throw out there all the time. It is never too late. You can start when they are babies, like you did, asking questions, or you can start when, you have a son about to retire.
Yeah.
It is never too late.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, it's so, this, unbelievably rewarding. And both of my children individually, without knowing the other one was doing it, have come to me and thanked me from the bottom of their heart for how we raised them.
Oh.
Because now they're getting older, right? And they're starting to see the results of other people raising other kids. And they've come back to me and gone, Mike, Dad, thank you. And
so I want to share something with you. The night after my son killed himself, and of course we're feeling like the worst parent on the planet Earth. We're horrible. So we called our son last because he stayed up the latest. We had to call our parents. They're older, they went to bed sooner. So I called Richard and I told him what happened. And then he just goes into this, I don't know where he got this as a 22-year-old. And he goes, I lived in the same house. I grew up in that house. I love my neighborhood. I love you all. You all were great parents. And he just goes on. And I mean, of all the things I needed to hear at that moment, and from the person that was the most important to me in the world, it's who I heard it from.
Yeah, that's gold. Absolute
How
gold.
does a 22-year-old even know to say that? And I love the way when I was grieving, and I remember a friend was over and he said something and I started to cry, and the friend came over, oh, don't cry. And Richard went up to the friend and said, no, let her cry.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Let her
And
go.
then came out and gave me a hug and said, you cry all you want, Mom.
Yeah.
How did he know that? To
Yeah.
do that is like a 22-year-old. I'm still amazed. And that's what kind of reinforced that, all right, I am not as horrible. It took me a while to get to a place where I was hyper focusing on the 5% of parenting I did imperfectly, ignoring the 95% that I did right.
He got it
Which
from you.
so many of us do that, though. We don't appreciate the good parts that we do, and we focus all on our mistakes, and we start to get real caught into that. No one gives you a manual for this.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, they give you this baby and they tell you to leave the hospital. And I remember when I left the hospital going, they're really just gonna let me go home with this baby?
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
Yeah.
And
I felt
there's
the
that,
exact same way.
right. I mean, and there were many times where I didn't exactly know what to do, but I also think being vulnerable with your kids is really important. And I don't mean vulnerable to the part where you treat them like a therapist, or you say, we're going to lose the house, or, but more like, I've got a presentation at work and I'm really anxious. Can you just give me a random hug? Just little things of like opening up and letting them know you're human, and then giving them the opportunity to give you advice.
Yeah. Well, it's buy-in. It's buy-in. Okay.
Right.
No parent on the face of this planet is ever going to live a balanced life. It doesn't happen.
No.
It doesn't happen. But what happens is, if you don't live a balanced life and you don't share with your children and or your spouse what's happening, you build resentment. If you sit with them and you share with them what's going on and what you're doing to help support the family, they then appreciate versus resent what your imbalance is. Okay.
Right.
And
that makes sense.
It's a big deal, and it gives them an opportunity. So the interview we just did before you and I came on, or actually 2 interviews ago, pardon me. The first interview I did this morning was with a lady whose mom and dad had a janitorial service, and the janitorial service had one account. It's commercial janitorial service, had one account. The account was canceled by the corporation. And they literally went from a comfortable life to zero income, zero. And mom took it upon herself to sit the kids down when she was a child, sit the kids down and explain to them what was going on, and to share with them what her solution was, which was she was going to start the very next day. This is on a Sunday. She was going to start the very next day, that Monday morning. She was going to start a house cleaning business, which to this day she owns and has hundreds of homes that she cleans every week with her employees. She has a full company now. Okay. And this person that I interviewed said, look, when my mom sat with us and said that, it rocked my world, but it also gave me an opportunity to be actively involved in watching her pivot, in watching her deal with it. in watching her be flexible, in watching her take her frustration and turn it into motivation. And this lady that I interviewed is now unbelievably successful. And at the end of the interview, I said, you may want to go give mama a hug. And she's like, I'm hugging both of them, right? Mom and dad. But it was one of those things where when we told her life story, we got to the end of it and she's like, oh my goodness, I hadn't even thought about it that way. But it really was an unbelievable opportunity for her and her siblings to learn about life.
Right.
And to learn about business, right? And
you're also triggering or activating them with their own skills of thinking what they would do.
Yeah.
Their critical thinking skills. So you're activating critical thinking skills, which is how you build resilience and coping strategies in your children.
Absolutely. And the best way to do that is to ask questions.
Right. Yeah.
So we're clear.
I never lecture. I never give unsolicited advice. And my children were told that if I give unsolicited advice, they needed to say, Mom, that is unsolicited advice. And I would shut up. And I kept that promise.
That's awesome. You did it right. You did it right. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. And I'm so honored that we had this time together. If people want to reach you, they can look up the Emotionally Naked blog, right?
Right. And they can look up AnneMoss Rogers speaker or AnneMoss speaker.
Okay.
I do a lot of webinars. I do a lot of training and public speaking to parents. Do a lot of universities, schools where I do the parents, the teachers, and the students, because I think we need that.
Will you send me a link to your sites?
Yes, I will.
I'll put that in your description so that people can reach out to you.
That would be great.
AnneMoss, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I cannot thank you enough. I feel so honored that we had this time together and we had an opportunity to put your story on our podcast.
Well, same here, especially since you had hundreds of submissions and I got lucky enough to get on.
I'm so excited. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you too, Mike.
I appreciate you. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.